In the heart of Vienna, 1882, a small, dimly lit studio sat tucked between the narrow, cobblestone streets of the city, almost hidden from casual view. The windows were grimy and streaked with the smoke and soot of the city, yet a faint, flickering light seeped from within, spilling onto the wet stones below. Inside, the room smelled of linseed oil, damp wood, and something indefinably metallic, a subtle tang that made the air feel alive, almost watchful. The painter sat hunched over a canvas, the brush trembling slightly in his hand, poised above the blank expanse that seemed to hum with expectation. There was a weight in the silence, a tension that pressed against the walls, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Candle flames flickered, casting shadows that danced and bent unnaturally, stretching across the rough plaster walls in ways that made the studio feel larger, stranger, almost infinite. He dipped his brush into a mixture of pigments, a concoction he had perfected over years of experimentation, and lifted it above the canvas once more. Each stroke felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were not merely painting, but summoning something unseen, coaxing it from some hidden corner of reality. With the first line, a faint impression of a face began to emerge, vague and hesitant, like a whisper in the dark. As he continued, the features sharpened, revealing a pair of eyes that seemed to glimmer with knowledge, a mouth curved in a half-smile that was neither cruel nor kind, but something in between, a familiarity that was unsettling. The painter leaned closer, squinting, adjusting the angle of light and the weight of his brush, as though coaxing the subject to reveal itself more fully, to show its true form. There was a silence that pressed against him, one he could feel in his bones. It was not the silence of emptiness but the silence of observation, as if some presence unseen had stepped into the room and settled in the corners, watching. The faint rustle of the canvas under the brush, the soft scratch of bristles against roughened linen, and the occasional drip of oil from the palette were amplified in the stillness, sounding almost like whispered words. He paused and lowered the brush, his eyes scanning the face he had created. There was something in it, a glimmer of consciousness, that made him shiver despite the warmth of the candlelight. The eyes seemed to follow him even as he moved, an impossible sensation that tightened his chest and made the hair at the back of his neck rise. In the days that followed, he became aware of other phenomena. Visitors to his studio would comment on the faces in his paintings, often with hesitation, as if afraid to speak fully. Some swore they had seen familiar features in the portraits, faces of people they could not place, or faces that had never existed yet were somehow hauntingly real. A few even claimed to have glimpsed the figures moving slightly when they weren't looking directly, subtle shifts that could not be attributed to light or shadow alone. He listened politely, nodding, but inwardly he felt a stirring of unease that he could not name. It was as if the act of painting was opening a door he did not entirely understand, and each brushstroke was a step further into a space where reality and imagination blurred. At night, the painter would sit before his canvases in the half-light, talking softly to the figures he had captured. He did not know why he spoke to them, whether it was an acknowledgement of their humanity or a plea for guidance, but he felt compelled to maintain the ritual. He gave them names in his mind, whispering them as he worked, imagining histories and emotions, desires and fears. Sometimes he felt responses, fleeting and subtle, the brush would hesitate, a shadow would shift, or the candle would flicker. He could not discern whether these were tricks of his mind or something else entirely, something that existed beyond explanation, and this uncertainty only deepened his obsession. Outside the studio, Vienna carried on with its bustling streets and gas-lit squares, oblivious to the quiet, uncanny work happening in the shadows. Street vendors called to passing pedestrians, carriages rattled over cobblestones, and the distant tolling of church bells marked the inexorable passage of time. Yet in the studio, time seemed to bend and warp. Hours could pass unnoticed, days blend together, and yet the faces on the canvases remained vivid, unchanging, and yet always evolving, as though alive. The painter's neighbors whispered rumors of strange sounds emanating from the building late at night, the occasional glimmer of a candle through drawn shutters, but most dismissed these as figments of imagination, a natural suspicion of the unknown. As his reputation grew, subtle shifts in the painter's demeanor became apparent. Colleagues noted that his eyes, once lively and inquisitive, now held a distant, haunted quality. He no longer laughed at gatherings or casual conversation but instead spoke in quiet, measured tones, his mind constantly returning to the canvases in his studio. Visitors who ventured close enough would sometimes glimpse a hint of obsession in his hands, the way they trembled slightly even when idle, or the way he would trace invisible lines in the air, as if measuring the space between the real and the imagined. There was an intensity in his gaze that unsettled even the most seasoned patrons, a silent warning that the world he inhabited was not entirely aligned with the one around him. The portraits themselves became subjects of fascination and fear. Eyes that followed, smiles that shifted in subtle ways, and expressions that conveyed knowledge of things impossible to know captivated viewers while leaving them profoundly disturbed. Some claimed to experience strange dreams after seeing the paintings, visions of people they had never met, memories of events that had never occurred. Others refused to return, claiming that something about the works looked into their soul and left a lingering unease that could not be named. Within the city, whispers began to spread, not loud enough for authorities to take notice, but sufficient to create an aura of dread around the painter and his work. The painter himself seemed both exhilarated and terrified by what he had created. He recognized the danger in his obsession, yet he could not cease. Each face was a puzzle, a key to something larger than himself, and every day that he did not paint felt like a betrayal of some unseen order. He moved through his life like a man caught between worlds, one grounded in the mundane realities of Vienna, and another that shimmered just beyond perception, populated by faces that existed in memory, dream, or perhaps a reality no one else could access. In this liminal space, he walked the thin line between genius and madness, and each brushstroke drew him further along that fragile edge, where art, obsession, and something unknowable intertwined with a quiet, inevitable terror. Vienna in the late 19th century was a city of contradictions, a place where opulence rubbed against shadow, and progress collided with lingering superstition. Gas lamps lined the streets, their flickering light casting elongated shadows over the cobblestones, and the faint echo of carriage wheels reverberated in narrow alleys. The city was alive with music, chatter, and the hum of intellectual debate, yet beneath this lively surface, an undercurrent of unease threaded through the air. Artists, philosophers, and scientists crowded cafes and salons, their conversations mixing theories of psychology, spiritualism, and the unexplained. In this restless environment, it was easy for the unusual to take root, for whispers of the uncanny to travel quickly among the curious and the suspicious alike. The painter's studio sat in a narrow, winding street on the outskirts of the city center, an unassuming building that belied the strange energy within. Its windows, partially obscured by grime and dust, offered only faint glimpses of the interior to the occasional passerby, hinting at flickering candlelight and shapes moving within. The street itself was lined with small shops and modest homes, a mix of artisans and merchants who had lived in the neighborhood for generations. They knew the painter by sight, though few had entered his studio. Some regarded him with curiosity, others with suspicion, sensing an unusual intensity in the way he moved through the streets, the meticulous care in his appearance, and the quiet intensity of his gaze. The painter's background was unremarkable at first glance, yet it contained subtle threads that hinted at his unusual inclinations. Born to a family of modest means, he had shown an early fascination with human faces, spending hours sketching neighbors and strangers alike with meticulous care. Teachers noted his talent but also remarked on his obsessive tendencies. He would repeat the same drawing countless times, scrutinizing every line, every curve, until it seemed to absorb a life of its own. In his 20s, he moved to Vienna to study under prominent artists, yet he remained largely isolated, preferring the company of his sketches to that of fellow students. Over time, he developed a reputation for precision and an uncanny ability to capture expressions that seemed to linger in the mind long after viewing. Within the studio, time seemed to behave differently. Sunlight, when it entered through the windows, appeared muted, as if filtered through a veil of perpetual twilight. The walls were lined with canvases at various stages of completion, each one dominated by a single, unsettling portrait. Some depicted figures who could have been any citizen of Vienna, yet there was something subtly unnatural about them, the eyes too knowing, the smiles too hesitant, the expressions hinting at thoughts just beyond comprehension. Others were of faces that no one recognized, yet viewers felt an inexplicable familiarity, as if the subject existed somewhere between memory and imagination. The painter moved among them with deliberate care, adjusting light, position, and detail as though negotiating with the very essence of the figures he created. The neighborhood itself contributed to the eerie atmosphere that surrounded him. Gas lamps sputtered unevenly, casting shifting shadows across the street, and the occasional fog rolled in from the nearby Danube, curling around corners and obscuring familiar landmarks. Children spoke in hushed tones of the strange man with the staring eyes, and older residents recalled whispers of long-past hauntings that seemed to seep into the present. Even the local cats avoided the studio, arching their backs and retreating into alleys when he stepped outside. These small details, seemingly inconsequential to most, added to the growing aura of unease, lending an almost supernatural weight to his presence in the city. The city's obsession with art and science created a unique tension that both enabled and constrained the painter. Patrons were eager for the unusual, for works that could capture the psychological depths of the human soul, yet society demanded rational explanation, a justification for the inexplicable. Critics debated whether his work reflected technical mastery, a glimpse into the subconscious, or something beyond human comprehension entirely. This intellectual scrutiny, combined with the painter's own self-imposed isolation, created a delicate balance between admiration and fear. People were drawn to his studio not merely to view portraits, but to witness the strange energy that seemed to radiate from both the painter and his creations. Even the city's architecture played a role in framing the painter's story. Vienna's narrow streets, Baroque facades, and hidden courtyards created natural pockets of shadow and silence. The painter's studio, situated near one such courtyard, became a nexus of quiet observation. Passers-by could glimpse the flickering candlelight through windows, catching brief reflections of moving figures and shadowed canvases. At night, the building seemed to pulse with life of its own, a faint glow illuminating the narrow street as the painter worked late into the hours. The city, vibrant and chaotic by day, receded into an almost dreamlike quality after dusk, mirroring the liminal space in which the painter existed between reality and imagination. Local cafes and salons were hubs for discussion about the painter, though few dared to speak openly. Patrons whispered about the faces he captured, describing them as too real or hauntingly familiar, yet unable to explain why. Philosophers speculated about memory and perception, psychologists discussed subconscious projection, and spiritualists hinted at the possibility of spirits caught within the pigments. These conversations, while fragmentary and cautious, fed the narrative of unease, spreading an almost contagious curiosity that drew more people toward the mystery. The painter, for his part, remained largely indifferent to gossip, absorbed entirely in his work, yet he was aware of the ripples his presence and art caused across the city. His solitary lifestyle intensified the sense of tension surrounding him. He moved quietly through the streets, careful to avoid unnecessary interaction, and spent hours in the studio, observing his subjects with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Meals were brief, social visits rare, and sleep often sacrificed to the pursuit of detail in his portraits. There was a ritualistic quality to his work, preparation of pigments, arrangement of light, and the silent contemplation of each brushstroke formed a routine that seemed almost sacred. Within this disciplined solitude, the painter cultivated an environment where reality itself appeared mutable, as though the city outside was only partially relevant to the lives contained within the studio walls. Vienna, with all its beauty, intellect, and shadow, provided the perfect stage for the unfolding of the painter's story. The city's lights, sounds, and whispered conversations formed a backdrop against which the subtle and unsettling nature of his work became magnified. As he continued to capture faces that did not exist yet felt deeply familiar, the tension between the ordinary and the uncanny intensified, drawing the city into a quiet orbit around the studio. In this delicate balance of isolation, curiosity, and subtle dread, the painter's obsession began to take root, setting the stage for events that would ripple far beyond the narrow streets of Vienna, leaving a lingering unease that no explanation could fully contain. The first signs of something unusual began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the faint tremor before a storm. Patrons who visited the painter's studio remarked on details that felt off, yet they could not articulate why. Eyes in the portrait seemed to follow them as they moved across the room, subtle shifts that could be dismissed as tricks of perspective but lingered in the mind long after the gallery visit ended. Smiles appeared to curve differently depending on the angle, sometimes soft and welcoming, other times tight and knowing, as if the subject held a secret just beyond comprehension. These anomalies were small, almost trivial, yet they carried a weight of disquiet that unsettled the observers and began to whisper of the impossible. Word of the unusual portrait spread slowly at first, carried by hushed conversations in cafes, muted remarks at salons, and fleeting mentions in newspapers that dismissed them as eccentricities of technique. Friends of the painter and occasional clients began to express unease. Some admitted to feeling a sense of recognition when gazing at certain faces, a familiarity they could not place or explain, as though they had glimpsed someone they should remember but could not. Others reported fleeting feelings of unease, a prickling sensation at the nape of the neck, a shadow that seemed to move in the periphery of vision. These experiences were difficult to quantify, yet they added a layer of emotional tension that began to envelop both the painter and those who came into contact with his work. Observers noticed a pattern that was at once fascinating and disturbing. Faces appeared to resemble no one known in reality, yet they carried a resonance that suggested some hidden connection to memory or imagination. Children visiting the studio sometimes recoiled, pointing to subtle features that they insisted were familiar, while adults could not explain their own discomfort. Scholars debated in quiet circles whether the painter had stumbled upon some new psychological insight, capturing archetypal human expressions that existed beyond individual identity, or whether something else, inexplicable, had begun to seep into his work. The uncertainty itself became part of the growing intrigue, blurring the boundary between rational observation and creeping fear. Even among the artist community, reactions were mixed. Some fellow painters praised his technical skill, noting the uncanny realism in the expressions he captured. Others felt unease, sensing that the work ventured beyond natural observation into a space that was morally and psychologically ambiguous. Conversations in studios and salons oscillated between admiration and quiet dread. One critic remarked that the eyes in his portrait seemed aware of the observer, a statement dismissed by some but whispered among others as a subtle acknowledgement of the painting's strange power. The painter, largely silent about these discussions, continued his work with a single-minded focus, yet the growing attention intensified the sense that his art had begun to exert influence beyond his control. The painter himself began to notice anomalies within his process. Brushes sometimes moved with an almost autonomous quality, paint spreading in ways he had not intended. Canvases appeared to shift slightly when unobserved, subtle distortions that vanished upon direct inspection. At night, he sometimes awoke to find portraits illuminated differently than he had left them, faces seeming to change expression or gaze, as if alive in the dim candlelight. These occurrences were brief, easily dismissed, yet they contributed to a growing psychological tension, a sense that his work had crossed into an unsettling territory where reality and imagination could no longer be reliably separated. Visitors who encountered the anomalies reported experiences that were difficult to rationalize. One patron, a middle-aged man of meticulous habit, described the sensation of being watched by the eyes of a portrait long after leaving the studio. Another, a young woman, claimed that a particular figure appeared in her dreams each night following her visit, always silent, always observing, and always unfamiliar yet inexplicably known. Children sometimes cried or clung to parents when faced with certain canvases, insisting that the faces were strangers who remember us, a statement dismissed by adults yet laden with an eerie resonance. Each anecdote, though anecdotal and fragmentary, contributed to an atmosphere that was both magnetic and unsettling, drawing attention while fostering unease. The painter's obsession with these anomalies intensified. He began conducting detailed observations of the faces he created, comparing subtle shifts in expression, variations in eye focus, and the placement of features. He recorded minute details in notebooks, sketches, and annotations, treating each portrait as a living subject that required constant attention. He experimented with different lighting, angles, and materials, seeking to understand whether the apparent anomalies were products of perception, pigment, or something far stranger. In these quiet hours of meticulous scrutiny, he became increasingly isolated, both physically and psychologically, his focus narrowing to the interplay between brush, canvas, and the seemingly sentient subjects emerging under his hand. As the anomalies became more pronounced, whispers began to take shape beyond the studio walls. Locals spoke of fleeting glimpses in dim streets, reflections that seemed to show faces not present, and inexplicable feelings of recognition when passing strangers. These murmurs, though subtle and cautious, contributed to a growing mythos around the painter, a tension between fascination and fear that pulled the community toward a shared unease. Scholars and journalists began to approach his work with both curiosity and caution, attempting to document the phenomena while acknowledging the difficulty of explaining them within the bounds of contemporary understanding. The painter's emotional state mirrored the growing strangeness of his work. He oscillated between exhilaration and dread, sensing that he was uncovering something significant yet intangible. Nights were long, filled with whispers, shadows, and the subtle, almost imperceptible movement of the canvases themselves. Days were brief, interrupted by fleeting visits and cautious observations, yet dominated by an inexorable drive to continue. He felt the weight of his discovery pressing upon him, a silent awareness that what he was capturing transcended ordinary reality and entered a domain where observation and creation intertwined, a precarious boundary that demanded careful negotiation yet offered no guidance. By the end of this period, it was clear that the anomalies were no longer minor curiosities but central to the painter's work and to the perception of those who encountered it. Faces that did not exist yet felt deeply familiar began to dominate the narrative surrounding him. The interplay of recognition, fear, and fascination set the stage for broader attention, drawing observers, skeptics, and the merely curious into a web of intrigue. These early signs, subtle yet insistent, marked the beginning of a transformation, both in the painter himself and in the city's understanding of the work that seemed to hover between reality, memory, and something that defied explanation. Word of the painter's portraits and the strange anomalies within them began to ripple through the city in quiet, almost imperceptible waves. Those who had witnessed the faces firsthand found themselves compelled to speak, though often in hushed tones or behind closed doors. In cafes, patrons leaned close to one another, voices low, recounting fleeting impressions of eyes that seemed to follow, smiles that shifted like shadows, and faces that somehow felt familiar yet impossible to place. Philosophers and scholars debated the significance, psychologists speculated about subconscious memory, and local residents exchanged tales of uncanny experiences that defied explanation. These whispers began to coalesce into a network of observation, a tapestry of unease that grew more substantial with each passing day. A cafe owner on the corner of a narrow street described a patron who had become unusually withdrawn after visiting the studio. The man, normally lively and talkative, would linger in the cafe for hours without speaking, his gaze fixed on a distant point as if recalling an image he could neither articulate nor escape. When pressed, he would mutter fragments, a pair of eyes that had looked into his soul, a face that recalled no memory but felt achingly familiar. The owner's account, though anecdotal, became one of many threads hinting at the pervasive influence of the painter's work, an influence that extended beyond the canvas into the minds and emotions of those who encountered it. An art critic, known for his discerning eye and sharp skepticism, visited the studio under the pretense of reviewing technique but left visibly shaken. He described subtle changes in the portraits during his observation, slight shifts in expression that seemed impossible given the static nature of paint on canvas. He spoke of a sensation that the figures were aware of his presence, noting that his own reflection in the window seemed to merge briefly with the painted faces, a fleeting yet unsettling overlap of reality and artifice. His review, cautiously worded to avoid sensationalism, hinted at a phenomenon that could not be readily explained by conventional artistic critique. Even children who wandered near the studio experienced inexplicable reactions. One boy, no older than 8, ran home sobbing after glimpsing a particular portrait through the half-open door. He described a face that remembered him, claiming that it smiled only when he turned away and grew stern when he looked directly. Parents dismissed these statements as the imagination of a child, yet their discomfort grew when neighbors corroborated similar tales. Small, seemingly inconsequential accounts multiplied, weaving a subtle but growing narrative that something unusual, and perhaps disturbing, was taking place within the studio. Local scholars and enthusiasts of the supernatural began to attend, some out of genuine curiosity, others driven by a desire to challenge the painter. They reported feeling an almost magnetic pull toward specific portraits, a psychological tension that left them unsettled even after leaving the room. Some claimed that staring into the eyes of certain subjects evoked memories they could not identify, sensations of familiarity that seemed real yet had no concrete source. The effect was cumulative, feeding both fear and fascination. People began to hesitate before speaking of the paintings, as though acknowledging them aloud might summon an unseen presence or admit complicity in a secret beyond understanding. The painter himself observed these reactions with a complex mixture of curiosity, pride, and unease. He noted the subtle psychological responses in visitors, cataloging them alongside his sketches and brushstrokes. He began to perceive a pattern in the interactions, a faint resonance between observer and observed, as if the act of looking at a painted face triggered hidden layers of consciousness. The studio became a stage for these silent dramas, a place where human perception collided with the mysterious qualities of his work, each interaction reinforcing the painter's obsession and intensifying his isolation. Among the local artistic community, discussions grew more animated. Some artists saw the portraits as breakthroughs, a new frontier in the depiction of human emotion and memory. Others whispered warnings, suggesting that the painter had crossed ethical or spiritual boundaries, that the creation of faces without origin carried unseen consequences. In salons and workshops, debates echoed late into the night, blending speculation with fear, admiration with moral apprehension. The painter, largely silent amid these conversations, continued his work, aware of the growing attention but committed to a relentless pursuit of detail and truth as he perceived it. As the whispers spread, the city itself seemed to shift subtly in response. Street vendors noted a change in the behavior of passers-by, people moved more cautiously, lingering longer in well-lit areas, glancing toward the studio as if drawn by an invisible gravity. Foggy nights magnified the tension, shadows lengthening unnaturally along cobblestones, while gas lamps flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The ordinary rhythms of urban life were punctuated by these anomalies, blending daily routine with an undercurrent of unease that only heightened the mysterious aura surrounding the painter's work. Some witnesses described encounters that bordered on the uncanny. A local servant recounted catching sight of a figure in the studio window, only to realize that no one was present when she approached. A musician reported seeing faces in the flicker of candlelight while passing the street at night, faces that disappeared when he blinked or changed angle. These experiences, difficult to verify yet persistent, reinforced the narrative of the painter's influence extending beyond the physical boundaries of his studio. Observers felt as though the presence of the portraits lingered in the city itself, a quiet but pervasive force shaping perception and memory. By the end of this period, it was evident that the painter's work had become more than art, it had transformed into a phenomenon that engaged the minds and emotions of anyone who encountered it. The whispers among witnesses, fragments of observation, half-formed recollections, fleeting sensations, served as both warning and invitation, drawing curious observers closer while amplifying their unease. Each account contributed to a growing mythology around the painter, one that blurred the line between ordinary reality and something deeper, more unsettling. The city, caught between fascination and fear, became a silent participant in the story, its streets, cafes, and shadowed corners echoing the subtle, pervasive influence of the painter's faces that should not exist yet could not be ignored. As the painter's work gained notoriety, whispers of disapproval began to surface from voices of authority, both secular and religious. Clergy in Vienna expressed alarm at the nature of the portraits, describing them as blasphemous and unsettling, claiming that to capture a face without its origin risked opening doors to forces beyond human comprehension. Sermons hinted at unseen dangers, cautioning congregants against fascination with images that seemed alive, as though each brushstroke carried with it a fragment of something spiritual and unknowable. The church's influence, though subtle in the city's bustling culture, amplified the sense of tension surrounding the painter, casting a shadow over admiration and curiosity alike. Art institutions and academies, long bastions of reason and tradition, struggled to respond. Critics debated whether the painter's work was a technical marvel or a dangerous aberration, with some dismissing the portraits as clever trickery while others noted their inexplicable impact on observers. Salon discussions became cautious and coded, as intellectuals feared both ridicule and moral censure. These debates, conducted in hushed tones and private gatherings, created a delicate balance between curiosity and condemnation, positioning the painter at the center of a cultural storm that was as invisible as it was pervasive. The painter, largely indifferent to moral judgment, felt the pressure nonetheless. Letters arrived from patrons expressing concern, some asking that he temper his work to avoid scandal, others entreating him to continue in secret. He sensed the weight of scrutiny pressing upon him from all sides, yet the act of painting had become a necessity, a compulsion he could not resist. The faces on his canvases demanded attention, each one insisting on being fully realized, and the growing tension only deepened his isolation. He moved through the city as a figure both admired and feared, his presence a reminder that art could provoke awe, unease, and even moral panic simultaneously. Public denial took subtle forms, both deliberate and unconscious. Newspapers reported only cautiously on his exhibitions, downplaying the uncanny qualities of the portraits and focusing instead on technique or composition. Gallery owners, wary of controversy, sometimes removed pieces from display or insisted upon careful framing to minimize exposure. Social elites, previously intrigued, began to avoid mention of the painter altogether, speaking of him only in whispers behind closed doors. This cautious silence added an eerie weight to the work, framing it as forbidden knowledge, an enigma that drew attention precisely because society sought to suppress it. Religious authorities took more direct measures. Priests and church officials issued warnings against visiting the studio, describing the portraits as dangerous distractions from faith, as though the faces themselves might exert influence on those who dared to look too closely. Parishioners were advised to avoid prolonged contemplation of such images, to resist the compulsion to peer into eyes that could reveal secrets of the soul, or even darker truths. The effect was paradoxical: the warnings, intended to deter curiosity, amplified it. People became more eager to witness the portraits for themselves, driven by the magnetic pull of the forbidden, the thrill of glimpsing something the authorities refused to acknowledge. The painter himself observed these reactions with quiet fascination. He noted the duality of fear and attraction in those who visited, cataloging not only expressions and movements but also the hesitations and glances of observers. He perceived that his work was operating on a level beyond mere artistry, touching upon something deeply psychological, perhaps even spiritual. Each warning, each whispered caution, seemed to confirm that the portraits were reaching into hidden corners of human perception, resonating with the unspoken and the suppressed. He felt a mixture of pride and apprehension, aware that the very act of creation had brought him to a precarious threshold, where art, morality, and mystery intersected. Attempts at suppression extended to legal and social pressure. Some patrons were subtly discouraged from commissioning new works, while others withdrew entirely, unwilling to risk association with something labeled dangerous or heretical. Salon hosts hesitated to invite the painter, fearing the judgment of peers and clergy. Even casual acquaintances approached him with caution, their curiosity tempered by societal expectations and moral apprehension. Yet these efforts, while effective in limiting overt recognition, could not extinguish the subtle, pervasive fascination his work evoked. The tension between concealment and revelation became a defining aspect of the painter's life, a quiet battle between societal control and individual obsession. The community's response highlighted the contrast between rationality and belief, reason and fear. Scientific observers, who sought to explain the anomalies through psychological or artistic analysis, found themselves challenged by the intangible qualities of the portraits. Religious figures framed the same phenomena as spiritual danger, insisting upon moral vigilance. The painter existed between these opposing frameworks, creating work that defied simple categorization, inhabiting a space where rationality and faith collided with personal obsession. This dynamic intensified the psychological resonance of the portraits, casting long shadows over both the artist and those who engaged with his creations. Even the ordinary citizens of Vienna began to feel the ripple effects of this tension. Street conversations, previously light-hearted and casual, were tinged with unease whenever the painter's name or studio was mentioned. Children were warned to avoid wandering near his street, neighbors exchanged knowing glances, and small rumors accumulated into a quiet but persistent apprehension. The city itself seemed to sense the duality of fascination and fear, as though the painter's work had introduced an undercurrent of uncertainty into the daily rhythm of urban life, a subtle and unrelenting reminder that not all could be known or controlled. Despite the attempts at denial and suppression, curiosity continued to draw visitors. People sought out the studio not only to witness the technical skill of the painter but to confront the inexplicable qualities of his work. Each encounter carried a mix of awe and discomfort, admiration and fear, forming a complex emotional response that reinforced the painter's reputation as both extraordinary and unsettling. The interplay of suppression and fascination created a tension that would define this period of his life, shaping the narrative of his work and amplifying the psychological and cultural impact of portraits that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. As the weeks turned into months, the painter's obsession deepened, consuming both his mind and his life. He no longer maintained a consistent schedule, abandoning meals, sleep, and social interaction in favor of endless hours before his canvases. The studio, once orderly, became cluttered with sketches, notebooks filled with meticulous annotations, and unfinished portraits stacked against the walls. Candles burned low, wax dripping onto wooden floors that were scuffed from long nights of pacing. Shadows multiplied and stretched in the flickering light, creating an environment in which the boundary between the physical and the imagined seemed to blur. He moved among the canvases with deliberate care, as if negotiating with entities that were no longer merely painted representations but participants in an unspoken dialogue. Sleep became elusive, and when it came, it was fragmented and haunted by the faces he had created. Dreams overlapped with reality. He would awaken, unsure whether the shadows in his room were products of imagination or extensions of the figures on his canvases. Sometimes, in the dim light, he thought he saw movement, a blink of an eye, a twitch of a smile, but when he approached, the face remained frozen in its painted stillness. The ambiguity tormented him, feeding an insatiable curiosity and a creeping paranoia. He began to speak softly to the subjects, naming them, imagining histories, engaging in conversations that went unanswered, yet which seemed to alter subtly the expressions before him. Isolation intensified the painter's perception of his work. He avoided the city except for essential trips, keeping to the shadows of narrow streets, his presence marked by quiet observation rather than engagement. When patrons visited, he would retreat into his ritual, guiding them with measured gestures toward specific portraits while watching their reactions closely. Eyes widened, lips parted, sometimes trembling, a subtle confirmation that the faces carried a weight beyond mere artistry. He noted these reactions meticulously, documenting every micro-expression and physiological response, as though conducting a psychological experiment in real time, yet one driven by instinct, obsession, and an elusive understanding of something beyond empirical measurement. The painter began to perceive a strange vitality in the faces themselves. Subtle changes in expression, imperceptible to casual observation, seemed to occur when he was not looking. A smile might curve slightly differently, a shadow shift across an eye, a gaze that once appeared vacant now seemed to follow him in the candlelight. He became convinced that the subjects possessed a consciousness separate from his own, one that responded to attention, observation, and perhaps even emotion. This belief drove him further into solitude, as he sought to understand the mechanics of the anomaly and to communicate with these seemingly sentient images. Neighbors noted a transformation as well. Street vendors reported seeing the painter at all hours, moving like a ghost among the cobblestones. A faint glow emanated from the windows late into the night, and occasionally the sound of whispered words could be heard, though indistinct and fleeting. Some remarked that the paintings themselves seemed to breathe in the candlelight, the faces emerging and retreating from shadow with an almost imperceptible rhythm. Stories began to circulate, quiet and tentative, suggesting that the painter had crossed some threshold where art, perception, and the unknown intertwined. Even those skeptical of the supernatural felt an inexplicable unease when discussing him or his work. The psychological toll of his obsession became increasingly evident. Days bled together, and time seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably within the studio. The painter's features grew gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken, yet filled with an intensity that unnerved visitors. He began to hear subtle murmurs during moments of silence, as if the faces themselves whispered histories or warnings just beyond comprehension. Sometimes, he would catch the faintest reflection of movement in mirrors or glass, a presence that mirrored the painted subjects. He could not discern whether these were hallucinations, manifestations of fatigue, or something more profound, yet they contributed to an overarching sense of psychological decay, a slow erosion of certainty and stability. The city around him continued, oblivious to the psychological storm within the studio. Gas lamps flickered over damp streets, the hum of carriages and distant church bells marking the rhythm of ordinary life. Yet within the studio, a different tempo prevailed, one dictated by the painter's obsession, the shifting expressions of the faces, and the subtle energy that seemed to pulse through the room. Visitors, when permitted, were drawn into this tempo, sensing a tension that was palpable and inescapable. Even the most rational observers experienced unease, their emotional response heightened by the ambient atmosphere of shadows, muted light, and the persistent suggestion that the portraits were more than art. The painter's routine evolved into a ritual. He prepared pigments with exacting care, arranged lights to maximize shadow and contrast, and meticulously positioned canvases to observe subtle interactions between them. He spoke to the faces at length, offering questions and observing for subtle reactions. Over time, he began to anticipate changes in expression, responding almost instinctively to subtle cues that no one else could perceive. This ritualistic engagement reinforced his belief in the autonomy of the painted subjects and intensified the sense that he was in communication with entities that existed between perception and reality. Observers outside the studio began to notice the psychological ripple effects of the painter's work. Patrons reported feelings of disorientation and mild vertigo after prolonged observation, a sense of being drawn into the eyes of the portraits, as if memory and identity were momentarily displaced. Children recoiled, adults hesitated, and even those familiar with the painter's reputation described an emotional weight that was difficult to quantify. These phenomena, though subtle, contributed to the growing mythology of the studio, positioning it as a place where art intersected with perception, psychology, and something ineffable beyond the ordinary boundaries of understanding. By the end of this period, it was clear that the painter's life and work had become inseparable. Obsession, isolation, and psychological tension were not merely side effects but integral to the process, shaping both the portraits and the perceptions of those who engaged with them. The faces, alive in ways both subtle and profound, acted as catalysts for fear, fascination, and empathy, drawing observers into a complex interplay of emotion and cognition. The painter existed in a liminal space between genius and madness, reality and imagination, a space where the act of creation itself became a conduit for something beyond human comprehension, setting the stage for escalation, confrontation, and the eventual unraveling that would define his legacy. Attempts to explain the painter's phenomena soon became a matter of intense discussion among the city's intellectuals. Psychologists and early neurologists, intrigued by the reports of faces that seemed alive and hauntingly familiar, speculated that the effects were the result of subconscious recognition, memory projection, or subtle manipulation of visual perception. They visited the studio under the guise of observation, meticulously documenting expressions and recording reactions, yet even their scientific detachment could not fully account for the unsettling resonance of the portraits. Some were drawn into the faces themselves, experiencing feelings of recognition, unease, and fascination that could not be rationally dissected, leaving them questioning the boundaries of empirical study. Artists and theorists proposed alternative explanations rooted in technique and aesthetics. They analyzed the brushwork, the interplay of light and shadow, and the painter's precise handling of facial anatomy. Some argued that he had developed a method of suggestion, capturing universal emotional cues that resonated deeply with observers. Others contended that the painter's obsessive attention to minute detail created an illusion of vitality, a projection of life into static images. While these theories offered partial insights, none could fully account for the breadth of experiences reported by those who encountered the portraits, nor the persistent sense that the figures were aware in some way of being observed. Amateurs of the supernatural and spiritualist circles contributed another layer of interpretation. They suggested that the painter had inadvertently captured spirits, echoes of consciousness, or fragments of souls within his work. Séances were proposed, not always by the painter but by those who sought to validate these claims, as participants speculated on the metaphysical nature of the images. Candles flickered in dim rooms as observers attempted to commune with the painted faces, reporting sensations of presence, fleeting whispers, or the sense of being watched. Though these attempts were anecdotal and lacking in formal methodology, they reinforced the aura of mystery, blending fear, reverence, and obsession in ways that science alone could not explain. The painter himself oscillated between rational analysis and belief in the extraordinary. He meticulously studied changes in expression, variations in gaze, and subtle shifts that seemed to occur in the absence of observation. He documented every nuance, hypothesizing psychological explanations while simultaneously sensing that the portraits existed in a domain beyond conventional understanding. The act of painting had become both an experiment and a ritual, a delicate negotiation between creation and observation, between logic and something ineffable. Each stroke of the brush carried a dual purpose, to refine the image technically, and to probe the hidden resonance that imbued the face with its haunting presence. Local philosophers debated whether the portraits reflected a new understanding of consciousness, perception, or memory. Some suggested that the painter's work revealed the latent capacity of human observers to perceive patterns that existed only in their minds, a psychological mirror that made the viewer complicit in the creation of life within the image. Others proposed that the portraits functioned as a bridge between the conscious and subconscious, an intersection where suppressed thoughts, fears, and desires could manifest subtly in response to visual cues. These theories were speculative, yet the very act of debate lent legitimacy to the notion that something unusual and significant was unfolding within the studio. Visitors to the studio began to notice patterns of interaction that defied simple explanation. Faces seemed to respond to attention, subtly altering expression depending on the observer's focus, mood, or proximity. Observers reported fleeting recognition, moments in which a face appeared to reflect personal memories, fears, or desires, even when the features themselves were not identifiable. Children continued to exhibit heightened sensitivity, sometimes recoiling in fear or asserting that a particular face knew them. Adults, too, experienced moments of vertigo or emotional resonance, a sense that the portraits had tapped into something deeply personal and unspoken. These experiences underscored the dual nature of the paintings, at once technically accomplished and psychologically provocative, tangible yet mysteriously animated. The painter experimented with these phenomena deliberately, adjusting light, angle, and pigment to observe subtle responses in both the portraits and the visitors. He treated each canvas as a living subject, a being capable of communication through expression, gesture, and nuance. Observers noted the intensity of his engagement, the almost reverent attention with which he worked, and the way the room itself seemed charged with an almost imperceptible energy. The studio, cluttered with sketches, notebooks, and half-finished canvases, became a laboratory for the study of perception, memory, and the unexplainable, a space in which art and science collided with something profoundly uncanny. The boundaries between explanation and obsession became increasingly blurred. While rational theories attempted to categorize the painter's effects, they could not contain the emotional and psychological impact of the work. Visitors left the studio altered in subtle ways, a lingering sense of unease or fascination persisting long after the encounter. Scholars, psychologists, and spiritualists all returned to their respective circles with fragments of evidence, anecdotal accounts, and hypotheses, yet none could conclusively resolve the mystery. This ambiguity amplified the painter's reputation, situating him at the nexus of admiration, fear, and intellectual fascination, and creating an environment in which every new portrait was both an artistic achievement and a psychological experiment. Rumors grew outside the studio, spreading in hushed tones through cafes, salons, and private homes. Patrons who had experienced the portraits shared partial accounts, carefully omitting details that might seem fantastical, yet the emotional resonance of the experiences persisted. The city itself became a stage for subtle tension. The narrow streets, dim lamps, and shifting shadows amplified the sense that the painter's work reached beyond the studio walls, touching the minds and perceptions of those who walked the streets. Fear, curiosity, and awe intermingled, forming a quiet but persistent energy that mirrored the strange vitality of the portraits themselves. By the end of this period, the painter's work had become a locus of both admiration and speculation. Scientific, artistic, and spiritual communities all grappled with attempts to explain the anomalies, yet the true nature of the faces remained elusive. The interplay of observation, perception, and psychological impact had created a phenomenon that defied categorization, positioning the painter as a figure of profound intrigue and subtle dread. His work existed in a liminal space, bridging the known and unknown, the rational and the uncanny, establishing a tension that would drive the narrative forward toward escalating consequences, heightened psychological stakes, and the eventual unraveling of both perception and reality. The gradual unraveling of the painter's world became increasingly apparent as isolation and obsession intensified. His studio, once a place of careful order, transformed into a chaotic landscape of canvases, sketches, and discarded experiments, each surface crowded with evidence of his relentless pursuit. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, distorted by flickering candlelight, and the air itself seemed dense with the lingering weight of unfinished portraits. The painter moved among the clutter like a conductor in a silent orchestra, orchestrating each stroke and adjustment with precision, yet the space pulsed with a life of its own, as though the paintings themselves exerted subtle influence over the room and its inhabitant. Observers noted that he became increasingly disconnected from reality. Conversations outside the studio, once tolerated, were now burdensome distractions. Meals went unprepared, letters remained unanswered, and visitors who were allowed entry were guided with rigid ritual, their movement through the space carefully choreographed to minimize disruption. Every interaction was a test, every glance a potential disturbance to the fragile equilibrium he maintained between the living and the painted. Even minor deviations, an altered shadow, an unexpected reflection, provoked anxiety, and the painter would spend hours correcting perceived imperfections or observing subtle changes in the canvases, searching for confirmation that the faces retained their uncanny vitality. The psychological intensity of his work began to manifest in physical ways. His hands were perpetually stained with pigment, knuckles raw from repeated manipulation of brushes and tools, and his eyes strained under constant scrutiny of fine details. Sleep deprivation took its toll, creating a liminal state in which perception and imagination intertwined, and the line between reality and the painted world blurred. Shadows appeared to move independently of light, subtle shifts in expression became impossible to ignore, and the whisper of voices, real or imagined, accompanied prolonged focus on the canvases. Each night extended into a delicate negotiation with the studio itself, a space that had become as alive as the faces it contained. Visitors who encountered him during this period were struck by the intensity of his presence. The painter's gaze, fixed yet subtle, seemed to assess not only the observer but also the observer's impact on the work. Patrons described a sensation of being measured, of their attention being absorbed and mirrored by the painted faces. Some reported a growing sense of recognition, a faint echo of memory or emotion triggered by the eyes of a portrait, while others recoiled, sensing a disquieting energy that was difficult to articulate. These responses, both conscious and unconscious, reinforced the painter's conviction that the faces possessed a form of awareness, a responsive essence that demanded constant attention. The city, though largely unaware of the intensity within the studio, began to reflect subtle echoes of the painter's inner world. Passers-by noticed unusual patterns of light from the windows late at night, faint shadows that appeared to shift independently, and an intangible tension in the narrow street where his studio stood. The fog that occasionally rolled in from the Danube seemed thicker near the building, curling around corners and obscuring familiar landmarks, heightening the sense of liminality for anyone nearby. Residents began to speak in hushed tones, sharing brief glimpses of figures moving within, though no one confirmed precise details, leaving the street haunted by speculation and imagination. The psychological grip of the portraits became more pronounced. The painter noticed that prolonged observation by himself or visitors triggered subtle reactions in the canvases, slight shifts in the gaze, minute alterations in facial tension, and changes in the perceived emotional tone of the expression. Whether these were products of human perception, ambient light, or something truly inexplicable remained uncertain. The uncertainty itself, however, heightened the tension, amplifying the emotional impact on both the painter and those who entered the studio. Each encounter reinforced the notion that the portraits existed in a liminal space between observer and observed, reality and imagination. Rumors and anecdotal accounts multiplied, spreading through Vienna with an almost contagious energy. Patrons who left the studio spoke in fragments, describing fleeting recognition, unsettling familiarity, and the sense of being watched long after leaving the premises. Children exhibited heightened sensitivity, often avoiding the street entirely or insisting that certain faces knew them. Scholars debated whether these reactions were psychological projection, a shared cultural phenomenon, or the result of something entirely beyond human understanding. Every retelling, every whispered observation, contributed to a growing mythology surrounding the painter, magnifying the sense that the studio contained not merely art but a subtle and pervasive force. Amid these developments, the painter's internal world became increasingly labyrinthine. He began to construct narratives around the faces, imagining histories, relationships, and emotions that existed solely within the boundaries of his studio. Each canvas became a character in an intricate web of interaction, a living participant in a drama that unfolded in tandem with the observer's perception. His engagement was obsessive, ritualized, and deeply emotional. He spoke to the faces as though they could respond, monitored subtle changes as confirmation of their presence, and carefully adjusted environmental factors, light, angle, brushstroke, to maintain the delicate equilibrium he perceived between life and representation. The boundaries of sanity appeared tenuous, both for the painter and for those who ventured near the studio. Extended observation led to emotional fatigue, subtle psychological shifts, and moments of disorientation. Observers sometimes reported the sensation that the room itself was watching, that shadows carried meaning, and that the portraits had an agency that went beyond mere pigment and canvas. These encounters created a feedback loop. The painter's obsession influenced the observer's perception, and the observer's reaction, in turn, reinforced the painter's belief in the autonomous vitality of the faces. The studio became a nexus of perception, emotion, and subtle dread, where reality and imagination were perpetually entwined. By the end of this period, the painter's life and work had reached a critical threshold. Isolation, obsession, and the subtle but undeniable animation of the portraits had transformed the studio into a place where ordinary experience no longer applied. Observers were drawn into an intricate interplay of emotion, perception, and imagination, while the painter navigated a precarious balance between creation, observation, and psychological unraveling. The tension between reality and the uncanny had reached a point where each encounter carried the potential for revelation, fear, or obsession, setting the stage for the next phase of escalation, where the boundaries between art, and observer would be tested in ways that would leave lasting impressions on both the city and the narrative of the painter's legacy. The collapse of the painter's world began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper carried on the wind before a storm. Those who had once visited his studio began to notice changes not only in the portraits but in the painter himself. His movements became erratic, his speech fragmented, and his focus narrowed to the point of obsession. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching across the studio in ways that suggested movement independent of light. The faces on the canvases, once enigmatic and subtly shifting, now appeared to pulse with a rhythm all their own, creating an environment in which the distinction between observer and observed, between reality and imagination, became increasingly untenable. Visitors entering the studio at this stage were struck by an almost tangible tension. The painter's eyes, hollow yet intense, scanned each person with a mixture of suspicion and expectation, as if seeking confirmation that the faces were still alive, still responsive. The canvases themselves seemed to react, subtle shifts in expression corresponding to the mood of the visitor or the painter. Observers described an uncanny sensation of being measured, assessed not only by the artist but by the painted subjects, as though the room itself had become sentient. Even those accustomed to eerie or uncanny phenomena felt a growing psychological weight, a persistent unease that lingered long after they departed. The psychological toll on the painter became increasingly evident. Sleep deprivation, intense focus, and emotional isolation coalesced into a fragile mental state. He spoke to the portraits as though expecting a response, questioning their intentions, admonishing or praising them, and occasionally retreating into silence when the faces seemed uncooperative. The energy within the studio was dense, charged with unspoken tension, as if every stroke of the brush and every subtle movement of a facial feature carried consequences beyond his comprehension. Shadows shifted unpredictably across the floor, walls, and canvases, amplifying the sense that the studio itself was part of a living, breathing entity. Observers continued to experience unusual effects. Patrons reported fleeting recognition, moments when a painted face evoked memories or emotions that they could not explain. Children recoiled from certain canvases, claiming that some figures knew them or remembered their names, while adults described disorientation and vertigo, a sensation that their own identities had been temporarily displaced. Scholars and intellectuals visiting the studio were confounded, unable to rationalize the effects despite extensive notes, sketches, and psychological observation. The line between experiment and experience, observer and observed, had dissolved, leaving only a persistent, disquieting resonance that permeated both studio and city. As the painter became increasingly consumed, he began to isolate further from the outside world. Streets he once traversed casually were avoided, interactions with neighbors ceased, and even brief visits from patrons were tightly controlled and ritualized. Each day followed a strict pattern of observation, painting, and documentation, yet within that pattern lurked unpredictability. The faces on the canvases seemed to shift when unobserved, subtle movements that vanished upon direct inspection. This phenomenon, whether real or imagined, intensified his focus and deepened his isolation, creating a feedback loop in which the studio became both refuge and trap, sanctuary and prison. Rumors in Vienna began to shift from fascination to unease. Tales of the painter's obsessive work and the strange vitality of his portraits circulated quietly through cafes, salons, and households. Patrons whispered of eyes that followed, smiles that changed expression, and fleeting feelings of recognition that were impossible to rationalize. Children refused to walk past the studio, and adults hesitated even when passing quickly on the street. The city itself seemed subtly altered, imbued with the weight of a phenomenon that, while largely invisible, was impossible to ignore. Even those who had never seen the portrait sensed that something significant, and potentially dangerous, had taken root. The painter's perception of the faces evolved into a complex, almost ritualistic engagement. He monitored subtle shifts in gaze, tension in the lips, and the interplay of light and shadow with obsessive attention. He began to imagine conversations with the portraits, constructing detailed narratives around each face, attributing histories, desires, and emotions as though the subjects were conscious participants. These imagined interactions became increasingly vivid, sometimes indistinguishable from reality, further blurring the line between the living and the painted. Sleep, nutrition, and social contact were all sacrificed to this pursuit, leaving the painter in a state of heightened perception, emotional intensity, and fragile sanity. Psychological strain extended to visitors. Patrons, scholars, and casual observers reported lingering effects after leaving the studio, dreams populated with unfamiliar yet hauntingly familiar faces, brief sensations of being observed, and a subtle, persistent feeling of unease. Children spoke of seeing figures in the flicker of candlelight or mist, figures that resembled the painted faces yet existed outside the studio. Even rational observers struggled to dismiss these experiences, noting the weight of suggestion, the power of atmosphere, and the almost inescapable intensity of the painter's engagement with his work. The boundaries between art, perception, and psychological influence had become irrevocably intertwined. By this stage, it was evident that both the painter and the city were enmeshed in a cycle of escalation. The artist's obsession drove increasingly complex engagement with the portraits, while observers' reactions amplified the painter's perception of their vitality. Shadows, reflections, subtle movements, and fleeting sensations combined to create an environment in which reality itself seemed unstable. The studio became a crucible, a place where the ordinary laws of observation, psychology, and social interaction were suspended, replaced by a heightened, almost supernatural resonance that affected all who entered and haunted those who remained outside. The culmination of this period marked a turning point. The painter, now entirely consumed, was caught in a liminal space between creation and madness. The portraits no longer existed merely as representations, they had become active participants in a psychological drama that blurred the boundaries of reality. Observers were drawn in, compelled by fascination, fear, and curiosity, while the painter navigated a precarious terrain of perception, obsession, and ritual. The city, subtly aware of the transformation, carried the echoes of the studio's influence, a quiet tension that lingered in streets, cafes, and private homes. The stage was set for the final unraveling, a point at which the painter's genius, obsession, and the eerie vitality of the portraits would collide in a climax of perception, emotion, and unresolved mystery. After the painter's collapse into obsessive isolation, the city itself seemed to adopt a quiet, almost reverent distance from his presence. Streets that once carried the hum of everyday life became subtly subdued near the studio, shadows stretching longer along cobblestones, and whispers of the painter's work traveled in hushed tones through cafes, salons, and households. Those who had glimpsed the portraits, even fleetingly, carried with them a lingering sense of unease, as though the faces had left an imprint on perception itself. Conversations grew careful and measured, the word painter uttered only when necessary, and even then in low voices, as though invoking the name aloud might draw unseen attention. Within the studio, the painter's engagement with the portraits had become both ritual and obsession. Each day followed a meticulous pattern of preparation, observation, and documentation, yet the boundaries between reality and imagination were increasingly tenuous. Shadows appeared to shift independently of light, facial expressions altered when unobserved, and subtle movements in the eyes of painted subjects suggested awareness. The painter spoke to the portraits, sometimes aloud and sometimes silently, attributing thought, emotion, and intention to each one. These conversations, whether imagined or perceived, consumed the entirety of his waking life, leaving him isolated from ordinary human interaction and entirely immersed in the world of his creation. Observers continued to arrive, drawn by the growing mythology surrounding the painter's work. Patrons, scholars, and curious citizens described sensations that defied conventional explanation, fleeting recognition, emotional resonance, and a subtle but persistent feeling of being watched. Children were particularly sensitive, often refusing to approach the studio at all, while adults hesitated, feeling compelled yet unnerved. Each encounter reinforced the painter's belief in the autonomy of his subjects, while simultaneously heightening the psychological impact on those who entered. The studio had become a space where art and perception collided, producing an effect that was as emotionally profound as it was unsettling. The psychological tension extended beyond the studio. Reports surfaced of fleeting images appearing in the periphery of vision, dreams populated by faces that had never existed, and brief sensations of recognition for events and emotions that could not be recalled from personal memory. The painter's influence had subtly permeated the city, creating a network of perception that reached far beyond the boundaries of the studio itself. Residents found themselves questioning the ordinary reliability of observation, aware that their own minds might be entangled with the painter's work in ways that were invisible yet undeniable. Isolation intensified the painter's fixation. He moved through the studio with precision, adjusting angles, lighting, and brushstrokes in response to subtle cues he believed he perceived in the faces themselves. Each canvas was treated as a living entity, responsive to observation, emotion, and ritual. The painter's physical appearance began to reflect the intensity of his work, gaunt features, hollow eyes, and hands perpetually stained with pigment. His movements became deliberate and careful, almost ceremonial, as if the studio were a sacred space in which every action carried consequence. Visitors were guided through this environment with meticulous attention, their presence carefully measured to avoid disrupting the fragile balance. The city's fascination with the painter grew alongside unease. Accounts circulated of patrons leaving the studio visibly altered, disoriented, emotionally unsettled, or unexpectedly reflective. Children reported seeing figures in flickering lamplight that resembled the painted faces, while adults spoke of shadows that seemed unusually animated. Scholars attempted to document and analyze the effects, but empirical observation proved insufficient. The phenomenon existed in a liminal space between perception, memory, and imagination. This ambiguity reinforced the sense that the portraits were more than mere representations. They had become active participants in a subtle psychological drama that involved both painter and observer. As the painter's obsession deepened, the city responded with cautious distance. Streets near the studio became quieter, cafes hushed when patrons mentioned the painter, and neighbors observed unusual patterns of light and shadow without daring to investigate. The combination of fascination and fear created an invisible tension, a quiet vigilance that mirrored the intensity within the studio. Even those who had never entered the space felt the weight of the phenomenon, sensing that the painter's work had introduced an enduring, intangible presence into the rhythm of daily life. Within the studio, the interplay of observation and response reached a critical intensity. The painter documented minute changes in facial expression, eye movement, and emotional tone, constructing narratives around each portrait that blended imagination with perceived reality. He spoke to the faces as though expecting them to reply, reacted to subtle cues, and adjusted environmental conditions to maintain the fragile equilibrium he perceived. This ritualized engagement, while intensely personal, extended the influence of the work, as visitors and observers became entangled in the painter's meticulously orchestrated interactions. By the close of this period, the painter's isolation, obsession, and the subtle vitality of his portraits had transformed the studio into a place of psychological and perceptual complexity. Observers, both casual and scholarly, were drawn into an intricate web of emotion, recognition, and unease, while the painter navigated a precarious balance between creation, perception, and unraveling. The city, sensing the weight of this influence, maintained a quiet vigilance, carrying the echoes of the studio into the rhythm of everyday life. The stage was set for further escalation, where the boundaries between reality and the uncanny would be tested in ways that would leave an indelible mark on the narrative of the painter's life and legacy. The painter's legacy, though obscured by time and whispers, lingered long after the studio's doors closed. Those who had encountered the portraits carried memories that were more than visual. They were emotional imprints, traces of recognition and unease that persisted in the recesses of the mind. Scholars and patrons alike debated whether the influence of the faces was a psychological phenomenon, a trick of perception, or a glimpse into something far more elusive. Every recollection was tinged with the tension of experience, the subtle awareness that the faces had changed the way observers interacted with their own memories and emotions. Stories began to circulate about the painter himself, though few could confirm details with certainty. Some said he vanished entirely, leaving the studio and its contents to decay in silence, while others claimed he continued in secret, producing canvases unseen by the world. The uncertainty only deepened the mystique surrounding his work, framing him as both genius and enigma, a figure caught between obsession and revelation. His name became synonymous with the uncanny, an invocation that elicited both fascination and apprehension among those who spoke it. The portraits themselves persisted as focal points of curiosity and unease. Families who had acquired them reported subtle changes over time, shifts in expression or a sense of awareness in the eyes that seemed to mirror the observer's presence. In some cases, children recoiled or hesitated near the paintings, echoing experiences of those who had encountered them years earlier. The effect was cumulative, a subtle layering of perception, memory, and emotional resonance that suggested the work's influence extended far beyond the initial act of creation. Each canvas became a silent witness, a repository of both observation and imagination, quietly reshaping the experiences of those who lived in proximity to it. Cultural memory preserved the painter's story in fragments, often filtered through rumor and hearsay. Salon discussions, newspaper accounts, and casual whispers contributed to a collective awareness of his influence, though the details were inconsistent and elusive. Observers spoke of fleeting recognition, uncanny familiarity, and the emotional weight carried by the portraits, yet few could articulate the phenomenon precisely. The ambiguity of these accounts reinforced the painter's enduring mystery, framing his work as an intersection of art, psychology, and something unquantifiable, a place where human perception and imagination met in a quiet, persistent tension. Attempts to contextualize the painter within artistic or scientific frameworks proved insufficient. Art historians analyzed technique, composition, and light, while psychologists explored memory, perception, and cognitive response. Spiritualists proposed explanations rooted in metaphysics or lingering consciousness, suggesting that the faces carried traces of essence beyond the material world. Each perspective offered partial insight, yet none could fully capture the subtle but pervasive impact of the portraits. The multiplicity of interpretations contributed to a layered understanding of the painter's work, one that was simultaneously grounded in reality and open to the extraordinary. Local folklore absorbed elements of the painter's story, embellishing details over generations. Tales of eyes that followed, expressions that shifted, and children who spoke of recognition became part of urban legend, passed quietly through households and markets. The studio itself, long abandoned, was remembered as a place of fascination and trepidation, a site where ordinary life intersected with the uncanny. Those who ventured near spoke cautiously, aware that the legend carried weight, yet drawn by the lingering traces of a phenomenon that defied easy explanation. Psychological and emotional echoes of the painter's work continued to surface unpredictably. Individuals reported dreams populated by unfamiliar yet hauntingly familiar faces, moments of inexplicable recognition, and an awareness of being observed even in private spaces. The portraits, whether physically present or merely remembered, exerted influence that blurred the boundaries between conscious thought and subconscious response. Memory and imagination intertwined, leaving an indelible mark on perception, shaping behavior, and coloring recollections in subtle, enduring ways. By the end of this period, it was clear that the painter's influence extended beyond the studio, the city, or even the individuals who had directly observed his work. His legacy existed in the liminal space between art and perception, where psychological resonance and subtle emotional impact intersected with curiosity, fear, and fascination. The faces he captured, though created in pigment and shadow, had become more than representations, they were participants in an ongoing narrative of human observation, memory, and emotion. The story of the painter, his obsession, and the eerie vitality of his portraits endured as a quiet, persistent presence, a reminder that art could reach into the mind and leave traces that lingered long after the act of creation had ended. Ultimately, the painter's work and its consequences remained unresolved. Observers continued to grapple with memory, perception, and the subtle influence of the portraits, unable to fully explain or dismiss what they had witnessed. The ambiguity preserved the mystery, allowing the legacy to endure as both cautionary tale and testament to the power of human perception. The faces that should not have existed persisted, echoing through memory and imagination, leaving an indelible mark on the city, its inhabitants, and the narrative of human curiosity, obsession, and the unknowable.